Each year, the Donation Committee supports organ donation education through a Donor Sabbath event in houses of worship all across the country. Donor families and recipients have the opportunity to share their stories by way of inspiring. So today, we will share our stories as part of our volunteer work with the Gift of Life Donor Program. The program that offers support to families when they're facing a loved one's loss and they feel they have no choice, and offer them the choice of organ donation. 113,000 people are on the list looking for a life-saving organ. And today, 22 of those people will die because no organ is available. And so what we'd like to do today is share 5 stories, our own personal stories, and 3 more, to hopefully inspire you to say yes to organ donation. And with that, I'll introduce Pam.
Good morning. This has been an interesting tag team between Janice and I back there on the soundboard this morning. Wait, it's stuck. So, in Ecclesiastes, it says, "There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." So, in the organ donation process, there is dancing and there is mourning. Mourning from the donor family and dancing from the recipients who receive those gifts that have been given. So my personal experience has been that I had the pleasure of having 2 children, and in between that, 3 miscarriages and 1 stillbirth. And my son was last. He was a miracle baby that they told us would never happen. And so you can see the pictures on the board are all of Christopher. He was my angel. He taught me so much. He was my teacher instead of me being his. He loved life and enjoyed every moment of it. I remember riding down the road one day, and I had been past there many, 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 many times and never noticed the field of daffodils. And one morning, driving to preschool, he said to me, "Mom, look at all those beautiful yellow flowers." And I noticed them for the first time. And so that's the kind of child that he was. And then, unfortunately, on this beautiful May day, he rode his bicycle to his grandfather's house. He got on the tractor and cut an acre of lawn, and then he got back on his bicycle to have dinner with his father. We had been divorced since Christopher was 2 and his sister was 8. He was now 13 years old. And while riding his bicycle to his dad's, he crossed the intersection at Delanco, Coopertown Road and Perkins Lane in Edgewater Park, right at the border of Delanco and Edgewater Park. And while crossing that intersection, he was struck by a speeding motorist using their car phone. Cell phones were pretty new at the time. And so it was a significant impact, and his body flew quite a distance. His bicycle was a mangled mess. And the traffic was detoured for a long time. The 911 call went up a little after 4 p.m. that day from 2 young men who were playing kickball across the street, and they heard the accident. A Delanco police officer and an Edgewater Park police officer both arrived at the scene, and they both gave him CPR. They worked very hard on Christopher, and I'm told that they got a heartbeat. And then he was airlifted to Cooper Trauma in Camden. My ex-husband and I had the privilege of riding together down Route 130 to go to Cooper Hospital. Arriving there, we went inside and went to the security guard at the desk to tell them we were there because, my words were, my son has been brought here. He was in an accident in Edgewater Park, and they said, well, we have a 20-year-old in the trauma unit. And I said, well, he's 13, and they said, well, then he's not here. So I gave them a photograph of my son, and he said, I'll be back in a moment, but we're certain he's not here.
In the early 90s, approaching the age of 50, I had a wonderful life. Never been sick a day in my life, raising 3 teenage children with no challenges, working in corporate America, actually traveling the world as part of that business. And I found myself waking up in the middle of the night anxious. No shortness of breath, no pain or anything, just anxious, wired. You know how that feels? And so I ended up going to my local doctor, Dr. Mark Riedel, a real doctor of all things, and expected he would give me some pills to put me back in the sleep cycle or something. But he was a good doctor. He asked questions like, what's happened recently? Well, I had a cold, flu or something. It went away, lasted longer than usual. He said, we need to send you over to Phoenixville Hospital, have your heart checked out. Have my heart checked out. But hey, when a real doctor tells you to do it, you do it. And so next thing I recall, 3 people in white standing at the end of a gurney explaining to me that based on our test, Mr. Gleason, you have 37% of your heart function working. Now I was a mathematician. 100%, 37%, about a third, right? Well, that's called ejection fraction. It's how hard your heart is pumping. And your normal is about 55 to 60. So yes, it was weakened, but not that terribly bad. But they said, we have 3 options for you. We're going to put you on medications, and the heart may heal itself over time. If that doesn't work, you do well on medication. We'll keep you on that. If that doesn't work, we have to consider a heart transplant. I look behind me. Who are they talking to? A heart transplant? Hey, give me the pills. I'm going to be just fine. This heart's going to heal itself. Well, let me tell you something. For the next 2 years, I got old real quick. Just walking to work in the morning, across the parking lot, I would have to put my bag down and catch my breath. And I didn't notice that when I talked, it was, a word at a time. I don't know if anybody else noticed it or not. They didn't say anything. And then finally one day I was working on some things and I couldn't quite focus on it. And I stopped, like, what was going on? And the best way I could describe it to you, if you've ever been swimming and got a mouthful of water and choked on it and a little bit got left down there, you know what I'm talking about? That's what it felt like. So I called my cardiologist and I explained that. She said, can you come here right now? As Art will tell you, if cardiologists come right now, you come. And she explained that's exactly what we have in the textbook to describe cardiac failure. And so it's time. You need to cease employment and go down to see the experts. And so I found myself in the very medical resource world we have here in Philadelphia, talking to the transplant program down at Hospital University of Pennsylvania. And they explained that, Mr. Gleason, you have less than 2 years to live. Now I have to share with you, that wasn't as scary as it may think, because you know what? I figured out long ago, if you're born, one other guarantee, you're going to die. Wasn't looking forward to it right then, but I had accepted that. You're living your life the best you can. The time's going to come. You got glory ahead of you, right? And so that didn't bother me so much as the next phrase, which was, but for those 2 years, you're going to be sitting in a chair, and you get over the table, somebody's going to have to help you across the room. Let me tell you something, that was scary, being handicapped the rest of my life like that. And so, what do we know about heart transplant? Nothing at the time, but they explained that people with heart transplants, 87% were still alive at the end of the first year. Whoa! I knew that somebody got a heart transplant back in the 60s and died shortly thereafter, probably $1 million in debt. We weren't about to do that, but that sounded pretty good. And actually, 79% were still alive 3 years later. And so, what should have been a difficult decision was an easy one. And I can still remember some hospital personnel, later on a social worker, and it was probably an interview that I didn't realize I was being tested on. And said, Mr. Gleason, this is not a black and white decision. This is a great decision. We don't know what your quality of life is going to be post-transplant. Let me tell you something. It was black and white to me. Did I want to live or not? I did. And so I said yes to organ donation. Ended up waiting in the hospital for somebody to die in just the right way. Only 2% of deaths actually die in a way that they can even be an organ donor. Half of them say no, so you're down to 1%. And then you have to be at the top of some list or something and be offered that organ that matches your blood type, your medical urgency, and the fit in that body. And so, in those days, if you were waiting for a heart transplant, you waited in the hospital. And so I waited, and I asked you, what was I waiting for? I was waiting for death. Either my own, or for somebody else to say yes at their time of death and offer their organs. And so I waited.
And so, they came back to say that it was my son. It's not typical for a 13-year-old to be 6'1" and 174 pounds and have a size 13 shoe. So they thought they had a man in the trauma unit that was in their early to middle 20s. They put us in a room and told us to wait for the doctors to come, and they would tell us what was going on. So we waited. And of course, in those situations, every moment seems like a year. So finally, the doctor came in to tell us that there was significant brain trauma, and there were a lot of broken bones. And they would have to do CAT scans and MRIs to determine the extent of the damage. And that there wasn't a lot of hope. There was less than a 10% chance of survival. And that we should go to the PICU unit and wait. So we did. And I recall as we got to the PICU unit, there was this large window and the sun was turning orange as it was beginning to set for the day. And looking out that window and saying, God, this is all in your hands. I do not have control of this situation. Please do what is right for Christopher. Did not know what that prayer really meant, but that was my clear vision. And so we waited for test results to come back, and during that time, I called my pastor. I was not coming to this church at that point in my life, and he said he would come to Cooper right away, but in the meantime, he had called, and the chaplain came to be with me. And this was the most beautiful experience because she was able to take me around the back way into the PICU unit, and I could see Christopher. That was such a blessing for me because I got to see him and to know just how serious the situation was. And we prayed over Christopher in the hopes that there was a miracle. A little later that night, my sister had arrived and my daughter was with me, and the doctor came in, the neurologist came in and said that the tests were back and that he had a broken neck, and they had done preliminary brain death test, and there was less than a 2% chance of survival. There really is no such thing as preliminary brain death test. By law, they have to do 2 sets of brain death tests, and the hospital sets the protocol as to the time between them. It has to be a minimum of 6 hours, but at Cooper, it's 12 hours. And so we would wait, and we prayed for a miracle for Christopher to survive this accident.
And so, as I waited in the hospital, facing the idea of death, the passage from Ezekiel really is the theme for my thinking these days. In 36:26, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And that's what I was waiting for. And so, 5 weeks into that waiting, actually there was 3 of us waiting at the time. Ron, John, and myself, we called ourselves the 3 heartbeats. Bodies eagerly awaiting transplant surgery. Beats. And about 5 weeks into it, the team came by this first day, and you're on medications that really strengthens the heart, so you feel pretty good. But all of a sudden, I wasn't feeling so good. When the team came in and said, "How you doing?" I said, "You know, for the first time, I feel like a patient. I really feel pumped." They said, "Okay." And the nurse was giving orders to up the drip. Next day, they came in and asked the same question. I felt the same way. They upped the drip again. When they left that day, I remember sitting next to the bed saying to myself, "Oh, wait a minute. I know what's going on. This heart's finally failing, and there's nothing more they can do." The mechanical assist devices that we have so common today were not available yet. They actually became available a month later. And so there were no options. And when they came in that third day, I said, "Let me see if I figured this out. This heart's failing and there's nothing more you can do. You've got the drip up as high as it goes." And they said, "Well, yes." I said, "Where am I on this list?" I thought there was a list, but really isn't. It's a database of patients, and it's matched against an offer when the donor family says yes. And with the right combination and urgency and so forth, you move to the top of the list that exists only for that moment in time. But the doctor didn't explain that to me. He said, "You're number 3 on the list, and there hasn't been any movement in 3 weeks." And I said, "Well, I'm not giving up, but please tell the team thank you for everything they've done for me." When they left that day, that evening, I was very calm, really no fear of death. But I said the Our Father like I did every night. And in the Our Father is a phrase that takes on extra meaning. Thy will be done. And so I accepted that, put my trust in God, and went to sleep, praying for my miracle.
So when the doctors had come that night, out of that abyss, I had recalled that my son and I had watched a television special on PBS about organ donation and transplantation, and we had the conversation that if anything happened to me, I wanted everything given away. Give it to whoever needs it. And I'm not sure if that's what I was thinking. I'm not sure what I was thinking that night. And I said to the doctors, "He's an insulin-dependent diabetic. Can he be an organ donor?" And the doctor said, "I don't know." And sometime through the night, a transplant coordinator had come in and reviewed Christopher's records, which you don't know that's going on in the back. And the next morning, my daughter, Kate, and my sister Kim and I, and the pastor, were with Christopher, and they had done the second set of brain death tests, and we were waiting for the results to come back. And I laid my head on the pillow next to my son, and I sang Amazing Grace in his ear, because he used to hum that whenever he needed comfort from anything that was going on in his life. I had just finished singing that in his ear when the doctor came in on Thursday, May 22nd, 1997 at 10:37 a.m. to tell me that my son was brain dead. Now please understand that brain death is difficult to comprehend because your loved one is on the ventilator, their chest cavity is still moving up and down, and their body is still warm, and they still have all these meds going through them. And so it appears that they're alive. So then other family members went in to just do whatever they needed to do with Christopher. And the transplant coordinator introduced himself, and he had found a conference room for us to meet in. And he explained what could be donated. So they knew that they could not recover his pancreas because of the diabetes. He also had asthma, so they weren't certain about the lungs. But the rest of his internal organs, his tissue, his bone, his skin, his eyes, his corneas, could be donated. My daughter very adamantly said, "You're not taking his eyes. You're not taking his corneas. Nobody's ever going to have those bright, sparkling blue eyes." Not understanding, and if they told us we didn't hear it, that it's just a clear film on your eye that they remove for a cornea transplant. Ironically, my daughter's first child, Kira, has Christopher's blue eyes. So she still sees them regularly. God does have a sense of humor. And so we had the conversation. Ultimately, the decision was made to only donate his solid organs. His father wouldn't allow for anything else. And rather than forego the whole process, I consented to only his solid organs. During the process, they asked a lot of questions, of course, about his medical history and his social history and all of those things. And while they were asking those questions, I said, "Wait a minute. I need some other information." My first cousin, his father and my mother being brother and sister, has polycystic kidney disease, and he's been dialyzed for 2.5 years now, and he is on the wait list for a transplant. Is there anything that can be done about this? And the transplant coordinator paused and had to get an answer. And he came back to tell us that it had to be a perfect match to bump him up the list. And it had to be what they called a designated donation. So they would have to have his name and his social security number, his date of birth, where he's listed for transplant, and so on and so on. So we called him and provided that information. He was pretty resistant to the fact that he might get an organ from my son. He was very resistant, and we finally convinced him that there was no alternative. It wasn't going to change the scenario that we were in, and if it was a possibility, that I would like him to have that. And so with that, we consented, and most people left, including his father. It was just myself and my parents and my sister and my daughter and the pastor who stayed. And we waited for 14 hours for them to take Christopher to the OR. What I didn't understand then is what they were doing was running his information in that database that Jim talked about, so that they could find the matches for the organs. And sometimes they would find a match and then they would get in to recover, and they found out that they couldn't recover a particular organ, so that person didn't get their transplant, unfortunately. And so sometimes it gets declined because the patient has a fever or whatever the scenario is. So it took that long for them to put the puzzle together as to who would be the recipients. And so with that, we waited.
Early the next morning, somebody came in around 5:30 and said, "We have a phone call for you at the nurse's station." Phone's there in the room, but it's turned off through the night. And so with IV pole in tow and slippers and PJs, I went out to the nurse's station to take the phone call. It was Heather, my transplant coordinator nurse. "Mr. Gleason, I think we have a heart for you." It's been 25 years, and I can still feel the emotions come up whenever I share that part of the story. And I said to her, "Thank you." And I looked up and said, "Thank you." And I called the family and said, "You better get down here, something's going to start happening." By now, you've heard from Pam's story. It doesn't happen quickly. And so it was sometime that afternoon when a couple of nurses took me down and said, "Start counting back from 100. And I got probably about 95, and I don't remember anything more than that. They tell me that I woke up around midnight, but I don't remember that at all. Anesthesia is very forgiving that way. And so it was the next morning that I opened my eyes and I looked at the clock and it said 6 o'clock. And we'd gone down around 3:30 or 4. It's about a 4 or 5 hour operation. And I didn't have any pain. There was a nurse in this closed room doing something with a tube in my throat. And so I realized this was a false start. This is one of those things that happened to Ron twice, where he went down to the surgery, but for whatever reason, when they went to recover the heart from the donor side, it wasn't right. And so I wrote on a note as she was working on my throat, false start, huh? And she said, Mr. Gleason, did they tell you? You have a new heart. It was 6 o'clock the next morning, okay? And I gotta tell you something, I took the deepest breath I took in a long time, because when you have failing heart, you don't get a good breath of air. Oh God, that felt so good. When the team came by a little bit later, they said, how are you doing? Fine. I said, how's the pain? I said, I don't have any. When the anesthesia wears off, you will. They came back about 4 hours later, around noontime, and asked the same question. I still didn't have any pain. It's amazing for what they have to do to get a heart out and in there, that there are very little sensitivity up here. Now, if you're talking about an abdominal transplant, kidneys and livers, that's painful as hell. I'll tell you that for sure, okay? But for the heart, it was very easy. And they said, all right, well, think you can sit up? I don't know, can I? So I sat on the side of the bed. And they said, do you feel like you can walk over to that chair over there? I'm game if you are. And so I found myself within 24 hours of getting a heart replacement, walking. Okay, it wasn't a marathon, but it was still pretty amazing. And so, a short while later, they said, we need to get you out of this room because we have a heart coming for John. Ron got his on Wednesday. I got mine on Friday, and John got his on Saturday. Happened in threes, often in hospitals, and we had 3 heart transplants in 4 days. And so, how are they doing these days, this many years later, I don't really know. I lost contact with Ron early on. He just wasn't a friendly person. John, we've contacted once in a while, and even though they're within an hour distance, we've never been able to get together. So I got to hope they're doing as well as I am. I've got to tell you, I feel pretty fantastic. And when we go back, and just before being listed for transplant, we had the opportunity to fly out to Chicago to attend my daughter's graduation. And we had to climb 3 sets of stairs to get up to their apartment. And with a failing heart, I was so exhausted, I laid down in bed and went to sleep. They went to the graduation. I didn't see the graduation at all. When they came back, they changed flights, they came back early, and the next month I ended up in the hospital. After the transplant, about a year later, got to go to Chicago again, climbed those 3 sets of stairs, attended church to see the baptism of our first grandchild. And I can still remember sitting in that church, looking down at that rock baby next to me, crying, thinking, I almost missed this. Today, between Pam and I, we have 7 grandchildren. And the oldest of those just graduated this past June, is now working as an engineer with Amazon. The second one is a junior in college. My, how the time flies. And so, it's been an amazing adventure, and a week later, I was out of the hospital, went back to work 4 months later, and have not stopped since. As I'm going to be 76 next month, people say, how are you doing? I said, I feel like I'm 50. 50 or 70 is the new 50. How's that working? And so things are going very well. And it's kind of hard to hold suspense on a story where you can see the results before you get to the end of the story, right? So let me turn this back to Pam. We have 3 more quick stories.
And so the short update is they couldn't recover Christopher's heart because they worked so hard to save his life, which is a blessing, but it was discouraging as well. And of course they didn't take his lungs or his pancreas, but they were able to recover his liver and both of his kidneys. His liver went to a 35-year-old man in Cape May who's a chef at a nursing facility, a long-term care facility in that area. His right kidney was very bruised from the accident, so it went to Pittsburgh because it got turned down in the region. because they didn't want a bruised kidney, but a doctor in Pittsburgh accepted it for his patient who had lost 2 kidney transplants in less than 3 months. But this one was a perfect 6-antigen match. And so he lived for 17 years and died from prostate cancer. But his journey of those 17 years allowed him to see his children graduate high school and college and walk his daughter down the aisle. What an amazing gift. His left kidney went to my first cousin because they were a perfect 6-antigen match, and he's doing perfectly fine. And so 2 people 22 years later are still living the life. And I think that's amazing. But Christopher didn't just save 3 lives. He saved many more than that. Because of sharing his legacy, many people have made the decision to be an organ donor and given life to others. Then I became a volunteer at the Gift of Life Donor Program, the organ procurement organization, and I find it fascinating that they didn't have a program for donor families. They only had volunteer groups for transplant recipients. And they're the ones who were procuring the organs. So a gentleman who had lost his mother and myself started Hearts of Gold, which is a volunteer group for donor families, and we did a lot of work, and we did peer counseling, and we had social workers come in and talk to us. We had team members from the organ procurement come in and explain brain death and what the process of that is, so that we could all understand our journey. And through that process, when you go downstairs today, you will see a quilt. And it was my desire to have a quilt. And so families get to make a quilt patch that's representative of their loved one. Then we have a quilt pinning ceremony where they can pin that quilt patch onto a piece of cloth until it gets to go into a quilt. And it's a very cathartic moment for the families, because not only have you done something tangible as a representative of your loved one, but now other people are going to get to see that. But letting go of that piece of cloth can be very difficult. And so I couldn't find anyone to sew it or quilt it. I could sew, so I sewed it together. I sewed the panels together, but I'm not a quilter. But ultimately, I ended up quilting the first one. It took 3 years to get enough panels to make the first quilt, which was dedicated in 2001. There are now 60 quilts in this project, and there are quilters in the Lancaster area who help us to quilt them together. So the newer ones look much more amazing than the first one. But it was still my privilege to do that in honor of my son. So my son, at first I always felt like I had a hole in my heart and I wanted to fill it. But I spoke with another person and they said, you never want to fill that hole in your heart because God put it there for a reason. And so this morning in the 8 o'clock service, they sang a song which is probably the most appropriate for my life and for the whole process of organ donation. And we all know it. It's Through It All. And it says, through it all, I've learned to trust in Jesus. I've learned to trust in God. Through it all, I've learned to depend upon God's word. There are no more appropriate words than those that explains my journey with my son, because God was with me in every moment of this transplant experience. Christopher's life was shortened, but God put him in my life for a reason, to teach me to be kind and patient and loving to others.
It's funny, in that earlier service, we had not talked, but when that hymn came up, Through It All, it touched my heart in exactly the same way, for those same words. And so there's a couple other quick stories to share with you. The first of those is from a Roberto Cuevas. Now, you often don't know anything about where your donor comes from except some generic information, maybe. And about 10% of those receiving an organ sometimes make contact with a donor family and know more. And so we have in the background here Roberto's picture. Roberto, back in October of 1994, was at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was celebrating his 38th birthday over in Brooklyn and was attacked on the street, beaten about the head with a baseball bat. Ended up in the hospital in a coma. Now, a coma is not death. But 8 days later, he progressed where his brain stopped. His brother, Gilberto, led his brothers and sisters to make a decision about organ donation. The registries weren't available yet then, but they knew their brother was a giving person, and Gil had worked in the hospital and saw the need. And so they said yes to organ donation, and Roberto's heart ended up over in Philadelphia. Where is Roberto's heart today? Here in Cinnaminson Asbury Church, still beating strong. I mean, let me tell you something. You think that's amazing? You ought to be inside looking out. And so every day, I count my blessings because of the generosity of a stranger who didn't know me that passed on his heart. And every year, I write letters to Gil and the family explaining that their brother's heart is still beating and what it's doing in the life that it now lives. Last week, I lost a friend, John Clyde, 26 years out with 2 heart transplants, passed away. He was in his mid-60s. And at his funeral last week, he died on January 24th. That's an important date. His daughter shared the following. In this very moment, you were telling me when you were getting ready for your first heart transplant in Wisconsin. You were thinking of dancing with me on my wedding day. I'm glad you got to do it, Dad. And I'm incredibly grateful for the nearly 32 years I had you on the earth as my father. How wonderful life was with you in the world. My heart is broken. I will love you and keep you with me forever. John got to see his daughter married last June. That's what it's all about. It's not about an individual receiving a transplant. It's about the whole family benefiting from that gift. Now, I told you that January 24th was important, and maybe you followed it on Facebook, because we've been praying for Katie Flowers. And on the same day that John passed, after 26 years with his heart transplants, 2 of them, Katie, at the age of 13, got her heart transplant. I can't wait to hear her story over time, but that's what it's all about. And so, in closing, I have one more quick story for you. You see Katie out there? A poem that somebody shared, not really a poem. I don't want to be buried with a single organ in my body. Give them to a child that has spent more time inside the hospital than outside playing. My eyes will give a grandma vision to see her grandchildren. My lungs will give a teenager the breath to dance the night away at prom. My heart will beat in another mother's chest to see her children grow up. If you have something you no longer need, give it away. And finally, a story I heard on a bus trip down in Richmond. A story about a father and his 2 daughters facing the decision of organ donation with his wife. Their mother died, and they were being asked about organ donation. The father couldn't see it. He said, I can't do it. The daughter both said, but Mom would want to. No, can't do it. And they continued that conversation even down in the cafeteria. An orderly came by and said, sir, can I say something to you? Yeah, what? It's not a question of whether your wife's going to be an organ donor or not. She will be a donor. Either a donor to the ground or to save somebody's life. And he walked on. And the father turned to the 2 girls and said, we need to go back upstairs. We've got some papers to sign. And so for those of you who were touched by our last time we shared this story 10 years ago, and have become organ donors, registering, telling your families, we say thank you. And for those of you who are still facing that decision, we hope that our stories have inspired you. When you no longer need them, save somebody else's life. Pam's going to do this with closing prayer.
Please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, you give us mercy and grace to get through our days, through the events of our lives, good and bad. We give you the glory, Father, and we're grateful for the heart that you were able to get for Katie. We are grateful for the process of the doctors and nurses and researchers who have made this a possibility to give lengthened life to those who need it. And Lord, we just lift up to you all of those who are waiting. Lord, we ask that those who are faced with a decision, that they are guided by you to make the right choice. Lord, in your name we pray.